Good evening, Battery members. As you are coming in, looking forward to a great conversation tonight on social media and its ability to disrupt us. Want to ask you as you're coming in, until we get to the Q&A portion, if you could turn your videos off. That way we can just focus on primarily the conversation between our two guests this evening. And then when we get to Q&A, I'll cue you. We can have people turn their videos back on. And it also allows you, if you want to just go into video settings and say hide non-video participants, that can have the view of the two guests that we have with us this evening. We will facilitate a conversation up here between the two of them for about 20 minutes or so. And then we'll open up for questions from the Battery members who are here. We ask that you pose your questions into the chat box, and then I'll be able to deliver those questions to Sinan and Eric at that point in time. And if we need clarification, we may have you unmute and ask it directly. And we will end right at 6 o'clock this evening. For those of you I haven't met, I'm JD Schramm. I'm one of the creative in residence at the Battery, and this was a program that I signed up for, and I was going to attend either way. And then they asked me if I would be willing to moderate and facilitate discussion. But tonight really is about our two guests. Let me first introduce the author and focus of tonight's conversation, Sinan Aral. Sinan is the director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, and is one of the researchers who uncovered the 2016 election interference, which is really intriguing to me, and just recently released the book, which we used in the promotion for tonight, The Hype Machine: How Social Media Disrupts Our Elections, Our Economy, and Our Health, and How We Must Adapt. And we are joined in conversation with him by Eric Brynjolfsson. Eric is the former director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. You can see a theme coming through here, and has just last year relocated to the Bay Area, where he serves as the director of Stanford's Digital Economy Lab. He's also the author of several books, including The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies. I am going to go silent and turn it over for a conversation between Eric and Sinan. Eric, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, JD. One of my greatest joys in life actually is reading and discussing path-breaking research and influential work, which is why I'm so happy to speak with Sinan Aral today and discuss his book, The Hype Machine. Let me just add a little more bio. Sinan's a pioneer in understanding social media and its influence. He's done a lot of path-breaking work on how to assess causality in networks, which it turns out to be especially tricky. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. His research forms the foundation for this book, The Hype Machine, which I consider to be the most important book of the year. And that's why I'm really happy to have a chance to talk more about it and give you all a chance to hear a little bit about it. I've known Sinan for over 15 years now. I don't know exactly what year you started at MIT. I have to go back and check. We admitted him to the PhD program at MIT back when I was over there. Then he went off and did a stint as a professor at NYU. And as soon as we were able to, we lured him back to MIT, where he's now a professor of IT and marketing, and he's the director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy, which is a big program that we have there to study these issues. He's done a lot of other stuff. I don't want to spend too much time going through his resume. Instead, let me just dive in and ask the Sinan question. You are a busy guy. You've got so many articles in top journals. You've done a bunch of startups and investments. You're teaching and mentoring. You've got a young son. I know that writing a book is not easy. So what is it that made you want to do that work and to write this book?
Yeah, as you well know, Eric, I've been researching the impact of social media on our planet for 20 years now. It started really 4 years before Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook, and I've been researching it ever since. And as I, got to this sort of moment in the research where I realized that, wow, stuff that I have been saying for a long time, that this technology isn't just about pictures of chihuahuas that look like blueberry muffins, but that it's going to have a tremendous impact on our democracies, our economies, and our public health, really started coming to fruition just over the last several years. People started to understand the incredible power that this technology has. And I thought that it was important that rather than the conversation be dominated by armchair theorizing about how social media affects us, that we really lay out for a broad audience what the science tells us about how it affects our economies, our democracies, and our public health, and what we can do about it. I really do think we need to have science under the hood to make the right decisions about what to do next, and that's really the point of this book.
Yeah, well, you mentioned science, and so one of my favorite articles that I quote all the time, I quoted this morning I was at a conference at Stanford on GPT-3, is that cover story you did in the journal Science with Deb Roy, and you looked at the spread of truth and false news. I think you want to avoid the word fake news because it's become so politicized, but you confirmed, sadly, what we all had feared, which is that lies spread faster than truth, at least on social media. A lot faster, they spread further. Why is that?
Yeah, so we did 10 years of research with Twitter. We had access to Twitter's historical archive with unprecedented support from Jack Dorsey and the whole team over at Twitter to give us kind of inside access to the historical archive, which is beyond the sort of traditional APIs that we would normally have access to. And we studied all of the true and false verified stories that ever spread on Twitter from 2006 to 2017. And as you said, we found that false news traveled farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information, sometimes by an order of magnitude. And when you see results that scary, of course, the next big question is why? And our original hunch was that, well, maybe false news spreaders are just different than true news spreaders. Maybe they have more followers, for instance, or maybe they follow more people or tweet more often, or maybe they're more often verified users of Twitter or have been on Twitter longer. And we checked each one of these internal. What we found was the exact opposite was true, that false news spreaders had fewer followers and followed fewer people, were less active, less often verified, and so on. So we had to come up with another explanation. And what we came up with was what we call the novelty hypothesis. So if you read the cognitive science literature, human attention is drawn to novelty. And if you read the sociology literature, you find that we gain in status when we share novel information because it makes it look like we're in the know or that we have access to some sort of inside information that other people don't know.
By sharing my knowledge of your papers.
Right. And so we tested that and found actually that the false news was way more novel than the truth. And then we looked at the replies to true and false news, and we found that people in reply to false news basically always were expressing surprise, anger, and disgust. So false news is salacious, it's shocking, it's kind of shock and awe, and we're much more likely to spread it for those reasons. And in fact, we're 70% more likely to retweet false news than we are true news.
Yeah, well, it kind of stands to reason that if you want to create something that's just an unbelievable story, it's a lot easier to do that if it's not even, doesn't even have to be true. I mean,
there's no constraints on falsity.
Exactly. You can make up, Hillary Clinton pregnant on Mars, and you couldn't say that if you had to be constrained by the truth.
Well, one thing I will add just on that exact point is, we've had the National Enquirer for a long time that made up stories exactly like the one that you just mentioned. Yeah. But the ones that I found to be most insidious, and the one that opens the book, is the annexation of Crimea and the role of what we call mixed news, which is essentially false news that's cloaked in bits and pieces of truth. So it's false at its core, but it sort of like covers its tracks with the truth. And those stories turn out to be incredibly insidious. And that's the story of the annexation of Crimea that opens the book.
Yeah, well, so that's interesting. I want to pick up on that. There's also the clear, I spent some time on Twitter. It's like an outrage machine. Anything that's just, shocking or amazing gets spread, and people are always yelling and shocked at each other. I want to come back to something you said a little while ago that, you traced truth and false news. one question I think a lot of us would be wondering is, well, how did you know what was true and false? I know that Jack Dorsey and other people are having a hell of a time sorting that out. So say a little bit about the methodology.
Yeah, this was really important. And I think this was one of the reasons why this particular paper and the breadth and scale of it over 10 years of data at Twitter was why it was on the cover of Science. So we worked with 6 independent fact-checking organizations, and we looked at all of their verifications of all of these stories over the 10 years. And we actually compared, how often do these fact checkers agree? And it turns out they agreed 95 to 98% of the time on things that were true or false. And we took those 6 independent fact checkers, the aggregation of all of them, as the ground truth as to what was true and what was false. And then we checked the fact checkers. So we had students at MIT and Harvard and Wellesley form a little group of fact-checking themselves and did extra fact-checking on top of it just to make sure that things were going in the right direction. So we were extra careful about defining truth and falsity.
Well, yeah, that's very labor intensive, and it's important for a study like that. There's a question about how scalable that can be, and that's one of the things. I mean, people, it'd be great if there's some automated way that you could do it, but it's not as easy as that, obviously.
Well, we have some ideas. We have some ideas about how we could solve it.
Well, actually, let's go ahead with that. There's a lot of directions with this, but let's hear some of those ideas, because I think the topics I wanted to get into was what should we do about this?
Yeah, this is a very difficult thing to solve. And as you can see, the tech companies have been flailing around trying to solve it for some time. But I think it's going to be, no one silver bullet solves this problem. I think it's going to be a concerted effort of 3 basic things at the platforms, which are machine learning combined with human in the loop moderators that are looking over what the machines are sort of flagging, combined with a very important element that has not yet been scaled the way it should be, is crowdsourcing. And that crowdsourcing piece is relevant for 2 reasons. So research we're doing at the MIT IDE, particularly Dave Rand and Gordon Pennycook, has found that when you nudge people to be reflective by asking them occasionally, does this headline or this news story seem true to you? It actually makes them less likely to believe known false news and to spread false news. And guess what? All of those times that you ask them whether something is true or false is a nudge to be reflective, which makes them less likely to share or believe the next false news story that they see in their feed that isn't one that you've asked them to label. So the crowdsourcing piece.
Sure, I just want to make them less likely to share false news. Does it also make them less likely to share true news, or does it start creating a differential?
No, it allows them to better differentiate truth from falsity and to tamp down on the spreading and belief in the fake stories. They just become more critical. They get out of, they switch between their system 2 and system 1 thinking, and they're much more likely to think about, maybe even fact check with a couple of clicks on Google, the story before they share it. They take a pause, and that really helps stop the spread, in addition to scaling billions of potential labels that you can then feed to the machine learning and the human moderators.
A lot of us do what Danny Kahneman calls system 1 thinking. We just react. It's like our reptilian brain. We see a cookie, we eat it. We see something salacious, we spread it. And you want to get us to be using system 2, our frontal cortex, like hopefully we're using right now, to think carefully about, that's what makes us human, is are we able to put together the logic and make sense of things. And too many people, it's not always a natural thing to do, and nudging them to do that is helpful.
Yeah, so the large-scale experiments, the latest research shows that when you're reflective, you believe and share less, and that these very subtle nudges are incredibly powerful in getting you to be more reflective.
Well, that's hopeful, because I had a conversation with Jimmy Wales once at Wikipedia about this sort of thing, and he convinced me, and you convinced me that, depending on how you design these platforms, you can do a lot to put your thumb on the scale to encourage more truth or less. And a lot of them, probably by accident, have ended up encouraging the spread of false news. And now it's time for them to go back. And you're making a face there. It's good that we're on Zoom. You think maybe it's not by accident?
Well, the four levers that the book describes are money, code, norms, and laws. These are the levers that guide the hype machine. Money is the business models that create the incentives for the platforms and the designs that they put out into these platforms, as well as the incentives for how advertisers and users use the platforms. Code is the design of the networks and the algorithms behind them. Norms are how we adopt, and laws are how we regulate. And the money is a big part of this, right? So the incentives are based around this attention economy, which runs on engagement. Salacious stuff is more engaging. It delivers a short-term boost in engagement, which helps the bottom line. It drives profits, but it's short-sighted because we know that long-term it creates all of this backlash, the Stop Hate for Profit movement, the regulatory backlash, the Delete Facebook movement, movies like The Social Dilemma, and that's not long-term sustainable. So I think that the real effective leaders of the new social age are going to be the ones that realize that their long-term shareholder value is actually aligned with societal values and that they need to clean up this ecosystem.
Yeah, well, we're going to take some audience questions in a minute, but let me follow up on that and say, so these algorithms, if all they're doing is driving engagement, then inevitably they end up driving some of the salacious content. And taking a longer view, these companies should be thinking not just let's get clicks and views in the next few minutes, the next few days, but what's going to make us a platform that people want to come back to a year from now. And ultimately, you think that's going to, their enlightened self-interest is to drive out some of that salacious content. Are you not sure?
Well, again, the Zoom is very helpful here because I think that it's going to take all of these four oars rowing in the same direction. I do think that these are externalities that the platforms will not just by their own good nature internalize the cost of on their own. Each of these are market failures. Privacy is a market failure. Fake news is a market failure. The spread of hate speech, it's like pollution in the environment. It's pollution of our information ecosystem, and it requires solutions to market failures that in part involve regulation and in part involve more enlightened leaders of these companies.
And what kinds of regulations? So I've heard some radical proposals, from breaking up Facebook, making it a public utility, having, different boards review what they say. I don't know, none of them sound super feasible or doable, but what we have right now also has a lot of problems.
Yeah, so so really, for those of you who've seen the movie The Social Dilemma, I'm a big fan and I recommend watching it. A lot of my friends are in it. But my book takes off where that movie ends, which is to ask, what do we do? What could we do, practically speaking, about the social media morass that we find ourselves in? The last chapter of the book is dedicated to what we can do. It's the longest chapter in the book, and it goes through each of these proposals that you're describing. I just published a paper in the Harvard Business Review last week, I think it was, about basically arguing that breaking up Facebook will not solve the social media crisis. And the reason is because this economy runs on network effects. If you break up the leading platform, it will just tip the next Facebook-like company into monopoly status. And all it will do is will create many small Facebooks that you then have to regulate in order to solve the market failures that we've been talking about. In addition, the value created by these platforms is created through the connections that are made on them. If you tear those connections apart without guaranteeing interoperability and data portability and social network portability, you'll actually destroy a lot of value. So what I suggested in the book and in this Harvard Business Review article is that you have to begin with structural reforms of the economy itself, which are interoperability legislation. There's the Access Act that's sitting in front of Congress right now, data portability, social network portability. Then you have to get to the tough business of solving each one of the market failures in turn. And it's going to take a lot of different oars rowing in the same direction. We need a national commission on democracy and technology to begin to bring all the experts to bear on exactly what we should be doing in this area.
Let me pick up on one of those ideas, the interoperability. As an economist, I appreciate the importance of these network effects, and there's benefits from being able to connect to, my cousins and people in other countries and not have separate network And the phone network is something that is interoperable. Different companies allow calls to go between each other. But I do remember, what was it, 15 years ago or so, it was actually very difficult to move your phone number from one carrier to one cell phone carrier to another. Number portability was something they said was technologically would make their servers melt or something. And ultimately, they refused to do it until Congress stepped in and said, we require telephone number portability. Is that a little bit of a model for what you have in mind, or is it too simple to think of it that way?
No, it's not too simple to think of it that way, although it's not an exact replica of the situation. The two best analogies are cell phone number portability and the interoperability that was brought to the chat market when AIM dominated the chat market back in the early 2000s.
Well,
when I say to you, imagine a world in which you couldn't call your friend from Verizon on your Sprint service, and you'd say I'm crazy, but that's exactly what we have with social networking today. The crazy part is to not be interoperable, not to have what we have today. So imagine a world where you can send messages from any social network to any other social network, and suddenly you realize that now they have to compete on other dimensions than locking you in. They have to provide better service. They have to reduce the phishing, the spam, the fake news, and the hate speech. They have to make things more secure, give you more privacy, and so on. When Europe instituted number portability, it created $880 billion of consumer surplus every quarter for years and years. When AIM was forced to be interoperable with MSN Messenger and Yahoo Messenger, it went from 65% market share to 59% the year after, 55% 2 years after that, and then it ceded the market entirely to the upstarts, Facebook and Google, just a couple of years after that.
Well, those two sets of facts really highlight the problem, which is that the social incentives are different than the private incentives. That this is something that creates value for society. And as much as I love the invisible hand in the marketplace as an economist, I also know that there are places where you get market failure. And this is one of those ones where the private incentive is to not be interoperable, to hang on to that monopoly status. And so if we sit around waiting for them to do the right thing, it's not going to happen.
Correct.
So we are beginning to get some questions here, and I encourage others to just put the questions right into chat. There's a question from JP Harbor, and I'll just shorten it a little bit. It's a long question. But his suggestion is that social media companies should just block forwarding of all news stories, except by people who are authorized journalists, and that they should, instead of sorting out what's true or false, they should just say that's not the role of social media. Social media should share social content, but not news. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I think that social media has an amazing amount of potential in the power that it holds. And part of that is in being a conduit for ideas, collaboration, speech, news, life-saving health information, attention drawn to national disaster. So when Nepal had the greatest earthquake it's experienced in 100 years, Europe and the US donated a total of $13 million, and Europe spun up a donate now button and raised $15.5 million from 770,000 individual donors in something like 145 countries. The mobilization potential of this is seen in the Black Lives Matter movement. It's seen in the Snow Revolution in Russia, the Arab Spring, and so on. A lot of those depend on news. News getting around helps people be outraged, for instance, about a police brutality event or something else. And so I think news is an essential part of our civil society. I think it should flow through social media. I just think we need to clean up some of the pollution. We wouldn't want to sort of get rid of the air. We just want to get rid of the pollution in the air.
Okay, yeah. So, and you've made this analogy as well, that with like labeling of food content, that we now have some rules about food being, checked and pure, and it's not the jungle the way it was 100 years ago when just anything goes.
Yeah, you can imagine, when you go to the grocery store to buy something to put in to consume as food, it's extensively labeled by law. But the information you put in your brain that you get on social media has none of that provenance as part of it. Why not? Why don't we know what the journalist, policy is, what the editorial policy is of this journal? How many independent sources do they need to check with before they run with a fact? How many people worked on this story? How many people were interviewed, and so on? I know how many calories my hot dog has and how many trans fats, and if it was produced in a facility that produces wheat and peanuts, if I have an allergy. I don't have any of the same type of provenance of the information that I consume.
Right. So let me talk a little bit about the algorithms and the technology, and just remind you of two seemingly contradictory results, one of them from you and one of them from Zeynep Tufekci, and have you kind of reconcile what's going on. So in that science article we mentioned before, you did something really interesting, which is you looked at how important the bots are, because a lot of us had a hypothesis that, these bots from Russia or wherever are amplifying fake news, and if we just could take them away, maybe we'd do a better job. And I'll just go ahead and say your result, which was that when you take them away, it didn't get a lot much better, because it was really the humans that were sharing the salacious content. Zeynep Tufekci has looked at YouTube and other places and shown that in many cases the algorithms do amplify more extreme views. If you go and read about wine, soon you're getting more and more extreme wine reviews. You start reading about conservative thought, maybe you get more and more into that end of the spectrum, and sometimes into some really dangerous kinds of views. Other cases, just esoteric stuff. But the point is that the algorithms actually were part of what was driving that. So is there a general rule here? Are there some principles? How should we think about the role of algorithms in driving more extreme content or driving false content?
Yep. And I should say that Zeynep and I are friends. If you've never read her book, Twitter and Teargas, I highly recommend it. It's a great thesis on the role of social media and social movements. So we have to make a distinction between bots and algorithms. So on one hand, we have software-controlled robots that are posing as people, spreading misinformation. And then we have algorithms, which are sort of the two main categories of algorithms that matter on these platforms are newsfeed algorithms that rank and sort information for each individual tailored to their interests, and friend recommendation algorithms that essentially guide the evolution of the social network itself. One of them guides the evolution of the network, the other one guides the flow of information over that network. Now, the bots, however, are software that are individuals that are attempting to spread misinformation. So when you look at the role of bots in the flow of fake news, you find this incredibly fascinating symbiosis. And you're correct that when you take the bots out and put them back in, that doesn't explain the vastly faster fake news compared to true news, but they do play a role. What they do, and on the cover of Science, we had this picture of a starburst pattern of fake news followed by the tendrils of what look like a jellyfish, which are the retweet chains of all of that information. That starburst tends to be bots. So they pounce on fake news first. They spread it wildly to as many humans as they possibly can. They incessantly @mention celebrities and politicians to get them to spread the false news. Then the humans take over, and the humans essentially are responsible for the further spread of it. It starts with celebrities and politicians, and then we just retweet, retweet, and retweet. And so there's a symbiosis between bots and humans that spreads false news, but bots alone cannot be, we can't claim that they're responsible alone, and we can't abdicate our own responsibility in spreading false news. But in a different chapter, I look at the algorithms and the degree to which they contribute to extremism, and specifically polarization, and the sort of tearing apart of people in terms of filter bubbles or echo chambers, putting them into different realities. And I do find evidence similar to what Zeynep found, which is essentially that in large-scale experiments, we see a narrowing of the diversity of information we consume, algorithmically curated for us, as well as a separation between what we read and the same types of people that are similar to us, what they read, compared to what people on, say, the other side of the aisle read. The algorithms actually do pull us apart into separate information ecosystems and do make what each of those ecosystems reads narrower and narrower and narrower.
So do you see that as a big part of why America seems to be becoming more polarized? Or well, is there evidence that America is becoming more polarized as sort of the casual empiricism would suggest?
Yeah, so this was a fascinating, so there's a whole chapter called The Wisdom and the Madness of Crowds, which gets into political polarization, how much the algorithms are responsible, and so on. When you read this literature, you notice that it's actually a very complicated set of data. And what you find essentially is that there hasn't been that much change in American society in terms of what people are, believing in terms of their political ideology and or sort of their views on major issues. But there's been a realignment of the political parties such that they are separated themselves. They've a list of sort of party affiliations towards certain issues that have become bifurcated from each other. So while ideological polarization is not really on the rise, affective political polarization is in the United States, which means a hatred between the parties. And what you see is you do see affective political polarization rising in many different parts of the world, although not everywhere. Now, the chapter evaluates what's the role of social media in that, and basically it can't be fully responsible for all of the affective polarization. You have cable news media, you have political parties and politicians that are very, divisive and so on. But when you look at the large-scale experimental evidence about social media itself, what you find is that over and over again, the algorithms reduce the diversity of information we consume and make it separate from what the other side is consuming.
I just want to remind the participants that I'm looking forward to your questions. You can just type them into the chat room and we'll have you get a chance, Sinan, a chance to answer those. I want to talk about, so there is this, there's fake news, there's this polarization. One of the things I've been observing is more what some people call nut picking, which is identifying true information, but it's sort of an extreme weird case. You pick out a nut on the other side, the one weirdo who normally people would ignore on the subway or whatever, who says something extreme, and then make them really famous. And is that something that it seems like it's happening more now? Is that something that social media has amplified? Is that one of the techniques?
It certainly makes things much more probable. So I'll give you a perfect example, and part of the story that opens the book is this annexation of Crimea. Yeah. And when we looked at this category of mixed news, which is partially true and partially false, we saw a spike in the 10-year history of Twitter in the 2 months around the annexation of Crimea that ended as quickly as it began. It was over 4 times larger than any other spike in mixed news. And when we looked at the individual stories, we found stories that were essentially fake people on Facebook who were invented sort of the week before, who had never had any friends on Facebook, but were suddenly going viral in 3 different languages. And the exact same stories that they were going viral with, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was essentially saying almost verbatim the same things in front of the UN, in front of the Human Rights Council, and so on. And so you can imagine that those kinds of outliers in data are not just sort of random. They typically signal a coordinated attempt to make a certain story go viral through the use of bots and humans and fake accounts and so on, botnets.
And so, as you suggest, some foreign countries are involved in this coordinated attempt. We can talk about some corporations. I mean, you could call it advertising as a coordinated attempt and using social media. But just on the topic of foreign interference, you mentioned the social dilemma. I don't know if you've had a chance to see Gibby's documentary on HBO called Agents of Chaos about Russia's interference in the last election, whether you have an opinion on that. Is that okay?
I haven't seen that exact documentary, but I have seen several and read several books in that area. And what my book does is it evaluates the evidence that we have to date about whether Russia tipped the 2016 presidential election, evaluates all of the scientific evidence on the ability of social media messages to change vote choice, to change voter turnout, evaluates the reach, scope, and scale and targeting of Russia's efforts, and also gets into what they're doing this year, which is way more sophisticated, and we are almost no better prepared than we were in 2016.
Well, I was going to hold that question a little later, but let's go ahead and dive into that a bit. So we have an election coming up in just a few weeks here, and you see their interferences being worse this time around? Is it?
Yeah. I mean, so, in 2016, they spread manipulative messages to 126 million people on Facebook, 20 million people on Instagram, 10 million tweets from accounts with 6 million followers, 43 hours of YouTube content, and they are doing as much this year. They are much more sophisticated. So they're nudging real American citizens to share misinformation rather than impersonating them to get around platform rules against inauthentic accounts and content. They've moved their servers to domestic soil to avoid domestic surveillance because our intelligence agencies are less able to surveil on domestic soil, on US soil. They've infiltrated Iran's cyber war department, perhaps to launch attacks made to look like they came from Tehran. And they're doing all of this during a global pandemic in the midst of tremendous amounts of civil unrest stemming from the justifiable social movements against police brutality, but also turning into what, I don't know if you've read this, but there's essentially been a run on guns and ammo. We just had a plot to kidnap and kill the governor of Michigan. These are not fictions. These are actual facts. And what I fear almost more than Russia's ability to change people's vote, I think people know how they want to vote in this election. What I fear more is the violence, not the vote. That somehow the uncertainty around in-person voting and mail-in voting is going to create stories, fake stories that are going to spread, that are going to result in people taking up arms, going to voting areas, trying to suppress the vote or protect people's right to vote. And so I think the violence and the chaos is something we have to be very concerned about.
And is this something that Facebook, Twitter can and should be stopping? Is this a job for the FBI and the Department of Justice? Is this a job for us as individuals? How do we counter that?
Well, those three things in turn. So I think absolutely the platforms can and should be dealing with this. Absolutely, they should be coordinating with the FBI and with local law enforcement to deal with any kind of information that they get on credible threats like the one that was leveled against Michigan's governor. And unfortunately, I think that, I wish that the Department of Justice was a little bit less politicized than it seems to have been recently. But I think that the Department of Justice should also be taking a strong look at how to maintain the integrity of our elections and to reduce the potential violence that could ensue around them.
Well, on one of those, as I understand, according to one of the questions here, there have been limits on retweets by Twitter imposed to the election to affect it. How do you see that affecting the dissemination of false news and of information in general? Is that part of the answer? Yes.
So I think that you've seen both Facebook and Twitter take dramatic steps for them in the last several weeks. Facebook has said no political campaign can declare victory early. They will ban political advertising after the election is over. Twitter, between October 26th and Election Day, is not letting you retweet without quote tweeting, without adding your own context. They have been, you may have noticed, nudging you to
be no retweeting after October 26th, really?
After October 26th, if you want to retweet something, you have to quote tweet it. You have to add your own commentary to it. Between October 26th and November 3rd, during that period, that window, you can't just errantly retweet, you have to quote tweet on all content. And in addition, you may have noticed that they're already nudging you to read an article, like click on the link before you retweet it. This is a nudge that seems to be quite universal now. These are all ways to slow down the spread of information in general. So you'll also note that, for instance, WhatsApp reduced the number of reshares that were allowed to 5 and then to 1 to stop the spread of misinformation, specifically public health misinformation around coronavirus. And when you have false news traveling so much farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth, slowing down all information is probably a good idea to allow the truth to kind of catch up with the lightning fast falsity, especially during heightened moments like during an election.
Yeah, in a way that makes me a little sad though, because the promise of these platforms was to disseminate information instantaneously to billions of people around the globe. And because they've been hijacked by people abusing them, you know, one of the solutions is for these platforms to kind of hamper themselves and not make it easy to share information, because as you just said, that ends up being used for false news more than for truth.
And you can imagine that these are two broad buckets of approach. One is to fix the false news, the prevalence of false news through labeling, through nudges to be reflective, and so on, to deal with a scalpel to try and kind of deal with the falsity itself. And the other is just to slow everything down. And you can imagine the worse you're doing at the first one, the more your knee-jerk reaction is to do the second one. The best of all worlds would be to allow information to flow freely, but to eliminate the pollution.
Right. So on the other side, there's a whole set of technologies, especially from AI, that are have the potential to speed up, well, certainly false news and other kinds of news. You know, deep fakes, GPT-3, GANs, that can make it increasingly difficult. I mean, when Bob Woodward said, you know, this is what Trump said, one of the things that gave him some credibility is that, and I had the tapes here, but of course, those could be faked. I'm not saying they are, definitely, and even video could be faked. And so as it becomes less and less feasible to rely on that digital record, is that going to make it, you know, put us in equilibrium where we just can't trust anything?
Well, I certainly hope not, but the second chapter of the book is called The End of Reality. So I think that there is a danger of that. And I go into deep fakes and generative adversarial networks and what the implications of this are. It's already, audio deep fakes, video deep fakes are already having big impacts on business, on elections, on politics, and so on. And they're just getting better and better. I mean, we've seen these exponential innovation curves over and over again in Silicon Valley. The technology is just going to get better and better and better. It's becoming democratized, so we don't really have a strand of verification that can run through it. I think there's a role, for instance, for blockchain, maybe for some sort of watermarking of audio and video. I think there are a number of different, you know, ways that we could think about it. But right now, it's kind of the wild, wild west. It's a free-for-all, and the technology is just getting stronger.
Well, say a word or two more about the watermarking. You know, public key encryption could, in principle, authenticate information. Do you see that as a big part of the solution?
Well, I mean, I just read in the New York Post today that there are now the Burisma emails, right? So I predicted this in my book, actually, that there would be an October surprise around the Burisma emails. And the reason I predicted this is that there was a breach of Burisma's email through a phishing attack by what was thought to be Russia at the time, about a year ago. And you don't actually have to have the emails. You just have to have the story that the emails were prized out of Burisma at some point, and then you make up the emails. And you know, knowing whether those are real or fake emails would be important for an October surprise moment like this. And I think that for all important information, be it Bob Woodward's tapes or, you know, or video, other things that are, you know, interviews of politicians or, you know, smoking gun evidence in a case or so on, you could imagine that if Bob Woodward wants to be credible when he comes out with these tapes, that he might use a decentralized watermarking system that would, in an objective third-party way, be able to trace back and verify that these have not been altered, that they are the original tapes, and so on. And I think that blockchain technologies may be a way to do that.
Yeah, they can do it in a way that nobody can alter, and you can be assured that they've been, you know, done in that particular time or place if you want. So there are some tools, there's authentication. One concern, and this is a question from D. Mercadante, that if we do that, then, you know, sort of aggression's law, then people will just find another way to spread false news, and it'll just move to other platforms. Is that a problem? Is that, or, you know, which way do you see that going?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, and it is a problem. As we can see, this is a whack-a-mole issue. However, I do think that once you have a public that has an interest in living in a world in which their information ecosystem is cleaner, has less sort of falsity and so on, that the major platforms, the ones that comprise the largest fraction of information exchange and consumers on them and so on, under the right circumstances of regulation and competition and so on, will create environments that are better than they are today. Of course, there will be fringe, you know, 4chan and 8chan, you know, platforms where people will spread horrible stuff. The authorities will be all over those, looking for people who are spreading a lot of illegal stuff. And I think that will continue. There will be an underbelly. One thing that we haven't talked about that I've been thinking about recently is, you know, this whole notion of the splinter net, which is related to this question. You know, we have India banning TikTok. We have Trump banning and then approving the TikTok deal in the United States. You know, we have obviously the Great Firewall in China. There's this whole notion of different national borders, protectionist borders that would harbor different social networks. Now, if you think that the algorithms are going to give one perspective to one side and another perspective to another side, imagine a world in which every country or regional bloc has its own social media and lives in its own reality. What happens to our ability to cooperate and coordinate on some of the world's most pressing global problems, like climate change, for instance? Right. That is a global problem where the citizens and nations of the world have to come together and agree on something. If we don't have a shared reality on the facts on the ground on that kind of stuff, which could happen from a balkanization of social media or a bifurcation of social media, what happens then?
Well, it could even, and you know, it's scary enough happening at the international level. That would be horrible. It'd be, you know, one of the great achievements of the, say, starting in the 1990s was this global connection where we could all contribute to the world's knowledge and learn the world's knowledge. But it can even happen within a country, you know, as you hear different political groups starting up their own social network because they don't like the way the other social network is going. And it would, you know, if Americans or people within any country didn't even able to talk to people with different views, that would, you know, be pretty damaging. We're coming up to the end of our time here. I just want to ask one more really important question, which is we've talked about some things that Facebook and Twitter can do and what the government can do. And what can we do as individuals? What kind of, call it, information hygiene should we be thinking about to protect ourselves, to protect our friends and family, to protect our nation from the kinds of risks that you've been outlining?
Yeah, you know, I think that Congress sort of failed to act in the last 4 years between the last election and this election. They didn't act enough. The platforms are kind of coming with last-ditch Hail Marys in the last few weeks. They could have been doing a lot of this stuff much earlier on. And so it falls on us to defend our own democracy, and our democracy, our defense of democracy won't be in taking up arms against a foreign adversary that's invading our borders. It will happen online, on our keyboards and on our screens, and our ability to resist the penetration of false news from outside or inside, domestic terrorism, incitements to violence, and so on. So a few things can go a long way. So when I see fake news going across my social media, I see it typically preceded by the preamble, I don't know if this is true, but it's really interesting if it is, and then we share it. We got to stop doing that because it's designed to be really interesting if it's true, but it's not true. Secondly, the 80-20 rule seems to apply to fake news. So a vast majority of it can be debunked with a Google search and a few clicks, and can be fact-checked. Also, third, you should check your emotional pulse. So our research with Twitter showed that it was blood boiling, anger inducing typically. So if you see a news story that you're not sure if it's true or false and it's getting your blood boiling, you know, take a beat and step back emotionally from it and say, wait a minute, should I be suspicious of this? And check the original source. So frequently these are coming from fake news websites that are known fake news websites that masquerade as true news websites, but there's just a little difference in what you would expect as the URL, and frequently they contain, you know, words in all caps or spelling errors and things like that.
Well, that's great. So I really appreciate the work you've been doing and the time you put into making it accessible to all of us through your book, The Hype Machine. I encourage everybody to go out and buy a copy if you haven't already. It's a really important book, especially at this time right now with the election coming up. Thank you so much, Sinan.
Thanks for having me. And Eric, I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me.
It's a pleasure.
Eric and Sinan, thank you both. What a helpful, both informative and a little sobering, and at the same time, hopeful and action-oriented conversation. I have dropped the Amazon link to Sinan's book. Sinan has dropped his own link, which is probably a better, more direct way to go to purchase the book.
That's also good. It has some background on the book and so on.
Excellent. We appreciated you being able to both be with us this evening and have just a really rich conversation. And I will invite anybody who wants to unmute and applaud or put your comments in the discussion box. And really appreciate the two of you being with us this evening.
Well, thanks for inviting us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks everyone. Real pleasure. Thanks again. Bye now.